Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us. It's great to have you participating in our presentation this afternoon. We're really pleased to have Tyler Kelly joining us and sharing his knowledge about bees. My name is Dawn Hansen. I'm the Executive Director of the Bulkley Valley Research Center, and I'm hosting today's presentation from the traditional territory of the Gitumden clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. I want to let you know that we are recording this presentation and it will be available on the Bulkley Valley Research Center's YouTube channel in a couple of days after this. So if you want to share it with people that weren't able to attend, or you'd like to watch it again, or check out our other seminars that we've had this fall that we've posted on that channel, you will have the link and be welcome to do that. At the end of Tyler's presentation, we'll have a question and answer period. You're welcome to type your question into the chat box or to unmute yourself, and then I'll call people in turn. And let me introduce Tyler, and then I can pass it over to him. Tyler Kelly is the manager of a research group with Dr. Claire Kremen at the University of British Columbia, focusing on agroecological issues such as pollination, animal movement, and landscape dynamics. In 2019, he completed a master's degree at SFU, studying the complex relationships between plants and pollinators to better understand how those communities change and how bees alter their diets across the landscape. In the past, Tyler has worked on various taxa from insects to deer to Canadian lynx. And with over 500 species of bees within BC with specific life history traits and relationships, it sounds like there's a lot of information that you can share with us, Tyler. Welcome and thanks very much.
Yes, thank you for having me. Thank you to the Bulkley Valley Research Center for giving me this space to talk. I'm hailing from the Lower Mainland, traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. I'm originally from the States, so don't hold that against me, but I've been in BC for about 4 years now, studying pollinator diversity. And yeah, so hopefully we can teach you about ecology, and I'll kind of start with ecology and lead into impacts that are affecting bee diversity, and then go on to a sort of case study using blueberries within the Fraser Valley. And so I want to start with a broad appreciation for insects. I think insects are these mind-blowing little creatures that basically run the world. They have these fascinating adaptations and features and colors, and they have so many different complex ecological traits that are essential for the majority of our ecosystems, especially our terrestrial ecosystems, and so I just want to give out this sort of start of like, let's think about how cool these animals are. But we're also still learning so much about them. And so there are thousands and thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of insects, and we are really just at the tip of the iceberg of understanding them. But specifically, we're kind of looking at bee ecology for this talk. These are two little snowberry bees in the interior. I thought this was a very cute photo of the one sort of peeking in and asking what was going on. So did someone say bees? But for bees, especially in BC, we're kind of broken into 4 main groups. There's a few other ones I'll show in the next slide, but we have mining bees and sweat bees and bumblebees and mason and leafcutter bees. And so these are actually 4 different families. We have 6 families in BC. I'm forgetting at the moment, but we also have a few other sort of groups that fall into those that aren't quite along in the family realm. And so there's cuckoo bees, which are kleptoparasites, very similar to a cuckoo or a cowbird. Longhorn bees, which are related to bumblebees, but are the solitary version. Similarly, small carpenter bees, which are itty bitty little grass stem nesters. And then we have very unique specialist bees that only visit snowberries, or ghost berries, if you're familiar with that term. And so Just a broad overview of the different groups of bees that we have in the province. But bees are primarily pollinators. And so I wanted to kind of start with defining that word. I think we might throw it around a little bit. And I want to define that that is a relationship, that is a service. And so bees are visitors to flowers that aid them in making seeds and fruits. And so the pollinator, the bee, she's here, she visits the flower, she gets pollen, visits another flower, we get a bunch of fruits and seeds. And so I want to really highlight that this is a trade. The flower exists or is evolved because it wants this service. It is trying to get bees to move pollen and to similar species, and so or same species, other individuals. And the bee in that is being paid with nectar and pollen. And so that relationship is very important. You know, we kind of tend to think of bees out there doing this for the good of their heart, but it's not quite that simple. They need these resources. And so I'll kind of talk about a little bit of the misconceptions behind where we think about bees. I think we generally, when we're thinking about them, are thinking about these little cuties on the left, little golden honeybees. But in reality, most bees are like this. So most bees are solitary. Honeybees have tens of thousands of individuals within a single colony or a hive. These numbers can be really big depending on how clustered the colony is. But solitary bees, for the most part, are the main life history style, if we want to call it that, for bees. And so less than 1% of all bees have a social system, which includes having a queen. So most don't have a queen. Honeybees have a queen. Bumblebees have a queen, but it's a slightly different structure. Most bees don't make honey, or like bumblebees, they do make honey, but it's not in a harvestable way. And so I'll show some examples of bumblebee nests later, and you'll be like, oh yes, that's not we can't use that. And then because the kiddos always ask about this, it's like the number one question I get is like, do they sting? How do they sting? What happens? Do they die? A lot of them actually can't sting, or they don't die when they sting. So if a bumblebee is to sting you, she can probably do it multiple times. She doesn't really want to, though. Whereas a honeybee, they have barbs on their stingers, and so when they sting you, they pull out their venom sac at the same time, and then that will keep injecting venom into you. And so they have the sort of lady power, the numbers to do that suicidal sting defense mechanism, whereas solitary bees can't. They really just want to leave you alone and continue on with their business. But what makes a bee a bee? And so actually, it's these very specialized hairs. And so here is a pollen slide. All of these little purple things are pollens. And this is from my master's. I used to take pollen from bees and try to identify it, and so to see what they had been collecting. And so this bee in particular had been collecting a bunch of carrots and some roses and a little bit of dandelion and asters. But the interesting thing here is this long hair. And so it shows that it is branched. And that's a unique characteristic of bees, unlike maybe a more simple hair of other wasps, but bees have these branched hairs, and they use them in a very similar way. I like the analogy of you're up in Smithers, and so I think you might get the reference of if you're trying to sweep snow, you end up getting your broom or completely packed with snow. And so in this way, it's very, very similar. Bees are doing that with pollen. They're basically packing it into their body, using these hairs as a sort of basket or a carrying mechanism. And so different bee families do that in different ways. This bee is an osmia or a mason bee. And so she carries pollen on her butt. And so they're called the furry belly bees. And it's very cute because they'll run across a plant and they'll just shake their butt. And it's very fast. So they shake across and they're collecting and stuffing pollen into their hairs, which they'll then take and use to provision their nests. And I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. And so we'll talk about the Social bees, mostly bumblebees, are native social bees for BC. There are social bees elsewhere in the tropics. There are some stingless bees that are social, and of course, honeybees are social. Their nests are all quite different, but for a bumblebee, queens typically emerge in the spring. It can be kind of into the summertime as well, and they'll immediately start to build their nest. They'll uh, start visiting whatever flowers are available in that early spring. That's why it's very essential to have, if you're thinking about planting, having flowers in that early time of the year, which for Vancouver is quite early. It can be even in March. For other places, it's not nearly that bad, but March. And so queens come out, they start fattening up again because they've been hibernating, and then they start establishing colonies. And so this is what a bumblebee colony looks like. This is why I was saying they're not really a harvestable thing. They're not even nearly as big as a honeybee colony. They're only maybe up to 50 workers, which is a big worker or a big colony. And so that colony will establish and grow. And I added this little circle over here to show the comparison of that first generation of workers that queen produces. And so this is Bombus impatiens, which is the eastern bumblebee. It's introduced into greenhouses and is an escapee in the lower mainland. And so this is the queen, and you can see that that first generation of worker is itty bitty. And so they're often about the size of what seems like the queen's head. But after the colony gets going and those workers start provisioning the nests, the next generation of workers is quite big. And so you'll see the big queens come out very early in the spring, and then it might seem like the bumblebees are gone, or you might just see these really tiny bumblebees, which could be mistaken for other bees. But those are the first generation workers. The workers will live about 2 to 4 weeks, and that colony will last throughout the season of the warm months typically, unless there's a failed, they're not getting enough food or something else happens. And so then at the end of the season, or say the colony isn't successful, they'll start producing queens for the next year as well as males, which go on to mate, and then the queens go into hibernation. And so if you're seeing big bumblebees digging around in the ground around in the fall or late summer, that's likely queens of this year trying to go into a hibernaculum or a hibernation state. And then the whole process starts over again. And so quite of a closed system. And I forgot to mention that the colony, it dies at the end of the season. And so only the queen is the one that persists forward through the next year. Solitary bees have a little bit of a different structure, and it's a little bit more of a mixed bag. They're all over the place with where they nest, how they nest, what time they mate, and other types of things. But for the general process, females come out in the spring or summer, and then they'll immediately start provisioning their nests, whether that's underground or within stems. And regardless of where they're doing it, they're all doing about the same thing. They'll construct the nest of some sort. Maybe it's with mud or plaster or resin. It could be leaves. And so they'll construct that nest. They'll collect a bunch of pollen. They'll lay an egg, build a wall. Collect a bunch of pollen, lay an egg, build a wall. Pollen, egg, wall, pollen, egg, wall. And they'll do that until they fill up that capsule, or maybe it's a tunnel underground. So there's a number of different ways. They will live also about 3 to 4 weeks, so really not very long. And then that whole species, unlike bumblebees, which will persist through a whole season, individual solitary bees generally only live for about a month. Depending on the region, there are elevational trends, so they'll go up, but within a space, they might only be out for a month. And so we see this turnover several times throughout the year of the bee community. And that's important for if you're thinking about planting for flowers, because your bees in August are not the same bees as the bees in April or May. Though some species do come out twice, they do have a second emergence. But added into this, while the females are doing all this hard work, we have two other sort of things that are happening. One is parasitism. And so I was talking about earlier, we have kleptoparasitic bees. And so if you're familiar with cuckoos or cowbirds that go into other birds' nests and lay their eggs, these bees are basically doing the same thing. So they'll go in, they'll find the nest, destroy the egg, and lay their egg, and then get out. And so they'll do that to usually a very specific other species. And so Coleoxys here, that's what this bee is called. I'm not sure they have a nicer common name, but they usually parasitize mason bees like this. And so they're very specific relationships, and parasitic bees are kind of a good indicator, we're thinking, as health for the ecosystem. So if you're able to support a bee, the non-parasitic bees, the regular solitary bees, and then also their parasitoids, you're kind of building this more complicated network or community of insects. And so in conjunction, males are emerging before or with or after females, kind of depends on the species. And I wanted to put this in here to show that males are often very adorable in that they have these little mustaches in many species. It's kind of a little hard to tell, but he's got a little mustache down here, and they generally have very long antennae. And so they have a segment or two longer on their antenna, and you can see the little segments going down through the antenna. And they'll also have a longer abdomen, a slightly longer abdomen. And so just as a little note of them. And so all of this is happening. We got the parasitism, the females provisioning, they're dying off, the males are dying off. And then the pupa, this is a pupa of a mason bee, not exactly this mason bee, but this will overwinter, and either they'll emerge before that time and just stay in the cell until it gets warm enough to come out, or they'll develop over the winter and then come out as adults. So in the spring or summer, whenever this pupa is done, we'll have a new generation. And so we restart. And I've mentioned it a little bit briefly about nesting. And so this is a critical thing, I think, if we're thinking about conservation efforts and, I want to start a pollinator garden, but I don't know where to go. Kind of have to think about three main groups. And so we talked about colonies. Bumblebees are really, for North America, the ones that we're doing for colonies. They will nest in all sorts of places, and we are trying to narrow it down, and by we, I mean scientists are trying to narrow down what they want. And it seems to be kind of all over the board. But some very common places are old rodent burrows or thatched ground, or even bird boxes. There's one species of bee here, which I like to call the bird box bumblebee, because they very, very much prefer to nest in bird boxes, or they're a common nester in bird boxes. And so again, these are mostly bumblebees and honeybees. The next big group are above ground nesters. So these ones are in trees and shrubs and logs and grasses. They might excavate those, or they might find grass stems, like that little carpenter bee. She'll nest in, she's 4 millimeters long, and she'll nest in this itty bitty little grass stem. And so it's adorable to watch them go in, but she will build a little nest like this in there. And then they'll use different materials, building blocks, mud, leaves, resin to do so. So if you see like hole punches in your plants, looks like a little cookie cutter, that's actually a mason bee that has come along, cut that out, and she's then used that to make a little bee burrito, little larva burrito. And so two big groups there are the mason bees and the leafcutter bees. And actually, most of our bees are nesting underground. And so this is a mining bee. Just a quick little clip. I don't know if it'll work for everyone. This video tends to be a little bit of a brat, but you can see this is just a weird sandy patch that I found in a park here in Vancouver, and she just dug right in. I don't know, I guess she smells where it's at, but a lot of bees are nesting in bad lawns or bare ground, or these weird sandy patches that end up in our parks. And so having a little bit of an ugly lawn might be a good thing. And so these are mining bees and sweat bees. And these really make up the majority of the nesting type for bees. So most bees are doing this. And then probably the colonies, because bumblebees have so many numbers. I'm going to tiptoe away slightly to talk about some other pollinators. There are a plethora of other things, including flies and butterflies, beetles, other kinds of wasps. And so bees are actually a wasp. They're just vegetarian wasps for the most part. And then also hummingbirds. And so all of these have slightly different relationships with plants and slightly different secondary benefits, I would say. Maybe benefits, a little asterisk on butterflies there. So hoverflies particularly, that's what this is right here. So this is an adult hoverfly, or if you're familiar, Syrphidae is the family. And as an adult, they visit flowers and they do some pollination, they eat pollen. And then they're searching around on plants and they're going to lay their eggs near where a bunch of aphids are. And so when these little eggs hatch, they turn into these fat little green grubs that become voracious aphid predators. And so they, hoverflies in a way, are a double benefit to plants. And as adults, they're doing this pollination, and as larvae, they're doing the predation. And so really great insects to have in your garden. Wasps are actually sort of similar in that way, though I would say probably a little less strong with the pollination. They'll do nectaring and they'll land on your plants, but they will also cheat. And I'll talk about that cheating in a bit when we get to a blueberry example. And so, is that 33 minutes? Yeah, okay. And so they will also consume and eat a lot of our prey that might be on the plants, so grasshoppers, caterpillars, other things. And so in that way, they can help as pests. And then there's a plethora of other things, butterflies, birds, beetles, that help with pollination, pest management, and long distance pollen dispersal. And so I added this in to just kind of show that a lot of things, unlike bees, which forage generally in one location for the remainder of their whole life, other things are transient. So they're moving between patches of flowers and helping get genetic diversity between different groups of plants. And all of this, we're still learning about the benefits of these other pollinators. So we're kind of thinking about this in terms of a responsibility pollinators have to the plant community, which, about 90% of all plants are pollinated by animals. So that's sort of an average across the tropics and temperate zones, but for the most part, 90 is accurate. Oops, that's not what I want. And then for our crops, it's about 70 to 75% of our crops are animal pollinated. So that's a pretty big number. But in conjunction with helping feed and pollinate the plants, they're also food for birds, fish, dragonflies, and a lot of other organisms in the habitat. And so in a way, I really think of them as an umbrella species or an umbrella group for conservation, because if we're kind of working to create habitat for pollinators, we're also doing these other large benefits of pollinating maybe our random plants that might be in the habitat, or our crops, or feeding other animals that we care about. And so in a way, they're very vital for both feeding us and many, many other species. And I think this will be kind of relevant when we tiptoe back into the example I have later. But I want to bring this in because I think bees are an incredibly interesting group when it comes to diversity. And there are about 25,000 species of bees in the world. And so you can see they come in all sizes, all types of shapes and sizes. A lot of them will be able to visit big flowers and small flowers, different levels of ability. And so they come out at different times of the year so that they can target different plants. They have different plant preferences. So some bees really only like snowberries, and that's what they visit and they pollinate. Then other bees, like bumblebees, they're pretty not picky. They can learn about any kind of plant they need to. And so I like to think about all of these bees and the bee community in general as a sort of bee army knife. And so they're able to effectively pollinate many different shapes of flowers and the plethora of resources that is on the landscape. And so, in this way, when we have so many bees and they are at different levels pollinating each plant, maybe we have 5 bees that visit this snowberry, and some of them are better or worse at it. And maybe the ones that are really good at it aren't very common, but we supplement that with the ones that are less good at pollinating that. And so, in this way, if we want to cultivate snowberries, then we need that large bee community as well as the associated plants to support them in order to get a full comprehensive pollination across the board. And so I think of this as the pollination buffer. But what does bee diversity look like in British Columbia? Apologies to everyone who's not in British Columbia, but I do think it's interesting. A lot of this data I'm going to show is in conjunction with BD Biodiversity Museum data with other people. So it's not exactly their numbers, but it is representative of what our, for the most part, understanding of bee diversity is like. And so here's a map of British Columbia broken down into different ecological regions. And you can see in the south, we kind of have a higher values of diversity. And for BC, we have about 500 species. This is the highest bee diversity in Canada. I think we're actually above this now. I have sources that say that this is higher, that we're just tipping the iceberg for some of these lower regions. And a lot of the northern regions, we haven't sampled as much or understood as much, but highest diversity in Canada. Most of that is in the Thompson Okanagan, so this desert dry area. Bees are most diverse in dry areas. Though bumblebees are also the most diverse here in British Columbia for the continent. And so that's for a number of reasons, primarily because of the Rocky Mountains and the boreal reach, which is basically the boreal forest crosses over the top of the continent from the East Coast and dips into the top of BC. And it brings a lot of Eastern species up and into here, as well as species from the Yukon and the Arctic are able to come down here into the northern bits of the province. Plus, we've got this dry arid zone, which is very different from the rest of these zones around it. And we've got the lower mainland Mediterranean sort of climates that bring bees up the coast from California. And so it's the highest bee diversity in Canada and the highest bumblebee diversity in North America. So these are some numbers, some rough numbers. I wouldn't quote these numbers because they definitely need updated and they're sort of a mix mash of a few different sources. It's very, very difficult to get accurate values of, somebody's calling me. Stop that. It's very difficult to get accurate species numbers, especially when you have 500 species in such a huge province. It's very challenging, but I wanted to give a rough value to these different regions. And I also want to note that a lot of the ones that have quite high numbers are our agricultural lands, are particularly agricultural lands that were growing crops that need to be pollinated. And so to me, we kind of have this fabulous built-in diversity system, and we just need to take those steps to use it and to engage with it in a way that is effective both for the bees as well as for our farming systems. And my example will hopefully iterate that, a case study. But before I get to there, I have to talk about some of the negative components that are affecting bees. And so we do know that there are worldwide insect populations declines. We know that for certain regions, very particularly within Europe and maybe the eastern coast of North America, it's very difficult to say for here because we haven't had as long of a record of observing insects in this region. But I'll talk about and walk through some of the common reasons for pollinator declines, including these sort of 5 broad categories. I don't have time to sort of tiptoe into each one of these. These are each like basically full scientific fields. So I will just briefly touch on them and in the end kind of circle back to habitat loss. And so together in our areas, all of these sort of work together as a multi-factored threat, which impacts not only honeybees, like these are all bad things that are happening with honeybees, but also our native pollinators. But unlike honeybees, we aren't, they don't, our native bees don't have a safety net. We are the safety net for honeybees, but for native pollinators, there's not a safety net that is helping them stay in high abundance or safety after, maybe a round of pesticides or disease or whatever. And so some of the few reasons that these are bad for bees, habitat loss is fewer resources, fewer nesting sites, so a little bit of less of a diversity of food for them. Pesticides is often a reduction in memory. There were a few pest folks that I think might have joined from Guelph. They're great people to follow to know more about pesticide issues for bees and the effects. It's kind of scary stuff. Disease and parasites, this is definitely outside of my realm, but some of the major things are like mites are a common thing, and that one's sort of a common thing that spreads from different communities of bees, as well as the deformed wing virus, which these bees are not able to fly. They're not able to go anywhere. They are, they came out of their cells like this. And so in conjunction, one of the things that we're trying to understand a little bit more is the competition between introduced species. And so here is that Bombus impatiens, the eastern bumblebee, and then a honeybee. And some of the concerns are that they are in high numbers, and so they might be able to transfer some of these viruses or pests or mites onto native species that then can't recover in any way. And so the combined effect there is something that we are is in review, basically. And then climate change on the board is like a large, overwhelming thing that will change many things, but one particular issue is a mismatch in activity. And so I said that most bees, most solitary bees, come out for this very specific window of time, a 3 to 4 week period. And a lot of times they have a very specific diet that they want. They have flowers that they want. But if we start seeing a mismatch, say the flowers bloom earlier than the bees are available, the bees come out in April, but the flowers aren't going to bloom until May. There's a mismatch in when the resource and animal are overlapping. And so we're kind of piecing together what that means for them. And so across the board, we have all of these effects hitting bees. I think for the most part, for the layperson, habitat loss is really the biggest one that any Joe Schmo can do something about. And so a lot of these other ones are kind of much bigger than, well, I can tackle by myself. So I have a little bit of stuff on habitat loss. And so I think I'm running a little bit low on time, but I have a case study for blueberries. Blueberries are BC is one of the biggest producers of blueberries in Canada and the world. This is with high bush blueberries. About 90% of Canada's cultivars are 96% of Canada's cultivated blueberries are exported or make up about sorry, I built this slide today and now I got flustered with the end of the time. So much of Canada's or BC's agriculture is produced by blueberries. That's what I'm trying to say. And it's about 55 million pounds of blueberries and a total value of 120 million. And so this is data from 2015. All of this is basically to say that blueberries are a very important crop for the province. But what I want to ask is, what about pollinators of blueberries? And so I got this data from these values from the Canadian government website. So just so we have that there. But blueberries present a little bit of a difficult problem for pollinators, and that becomes a difficult problem for farmers of blueberries, and that blueberries require buzz pollination. And so buzz pollination is this uh, trait that plants have to basically restrict the types of pollinators that they get. Plants don't always want everybody to come to them. Sometimes they want a very particular pollinator to visit. And so for blueberries, they have these urn-shaped little flowers that require the bee to land and sonicate at or buzz at a certain frequency. It's usually very high, um, to dehiss or get this pollen to drop so that it will release from the flower. And then that bee can go on and visit another flower. And so this is kind of what this sounds like, but with a thimbleberry. So they're very quick at it. Bumblebees are very fast at this. They will hit a flower and it's like little laser beams, zoop, 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 zoop. Um, and we found within lowbush blueberries, and so I believe this was probably in Michigan, that bumblebees and mining bees are transferring more pollen per visit than honeybees and blueberries. And so we kind of need to think about the type of bee or the pollinator that is visiting our blueberries, because not all of them are the same. However, for the most part, honeybees are kind of making up what we pollinate blueberries with. And so this is a graph from my old research laboratory at SFU. And it's the number of pollinator visits across 4 different cultivars of blueberry. So blue crop draper, Duke, and Liberty. And then it's just showing different values of visitors. So honeybees, bumblebees, and some other stuff. Really, honeybees and bumblebees are the 2 main pollinators for BC for blueberries. And so you can see that honeybees are making up most of that. However, if we look at those individual crops, cultivars, we see that they have very different floral shapes. My dog is having a temper tantrum. They have very different floral shapes in that blue crop here has long corolla and a very narrow opening, okay? Unlike Duke, which is shorter corolla, wider opening. Honeybees, which a honeybee is roughly about the same size that I showed you before. Well, she's a little big, but this flower is too restricted for a honeybee, okay? And so what ends up happening is that the honeybee visits, she tries to do that, and then she ends up biting in the back and stealing the nectar from the pollen, from the flower. So she's not actually pollinating the flower. I think someone walked in. So my dog has a cold, so if you hear him sneezing, don't worry about it. And so we have to kind of think about the flower shape. We've bred these flowers for productivity, but if we can't pollinate them, then it's maybe not working. And I'll kind of move on to habitat, because this is where our lab, the new lab that I'm in, is moving into. And so we know that insects want a diversified landscape. We know that they're looking for nectar, pollen, and nesting resources. And so we know that they want something like this, right? There's lots of different flowers. There's lots of different habitat structure. It's a complex, diversified landscape. But what they're kind of getting in a lot of agriculture is this. Not a lot of diversification, not a lot of places to nest successfully over the year. There's not a lot of food resources. This is a pretty extreme example, but it is relevant for a lot of our cropping systems. And so if we think about that for blueberries, here's a blueberry farm. This is kind of what they're getting. And on the farm, in the middle of the farm, not a lot of food. Blueberries, unfortunately, are very low in protein. So they're not really very attractive, and coupled with the fact that they are difficult to pollinate for most bees, bees are kind of wanting to find something more. That said, I did spend a lot of time in blueberry fields this summer, in and around, and they do have weedy edges. So bees are kind of going to those edges. And so understanding those dynamics a little bit with habitat is very important. But I'm going to talk about how habitat around the site and around your farm is beneficial both for bees as well as the farm. And so forests and surrounding habitat can support a greater diversity and abundance of pollinators than on the farm itself. Okay, and so here is a graph from Michelle Toshak and Elizabeth Ellie, colleagues of mine in the previous in my previous research group. And so it's pollinator abundance here on the Y, and then the percent of forest cover on the X. And so this is and each of these values or little shapes in here are different farms or sites that Michelle was collecting or observing. Some different types of farms and some near natural areas. And so you can see that when you get more forest cover in and around the farm or that site, you get more pollinators. And so this isn't an isolated example. We know this about many, many different types of habitats and many different regions, that bee abundance and richness are higher in diversified landscapes. If that's floral strips or that's hedgerows or adjacent natural areas, those are increasing our pollinator abundance. And there's an added effect here that's pretty cool. Michelle found that bees off the farms, so these ones that are sort of in these little triangle spots, natural areas or semi-natural areas, they had higher body fat content. And so this is in relation to blueberries, where blueberries don't have, excuse me, they don't have a lot of protein in their pollen. And so bees need to go search elsewhere. They're doing that. We know that they're doing that. They're leaving the farm to go find more pollen that will give them the proper protein. And so this body fat content, it means they're going somewhere else and work, or not having to work as hard to get that. So when they're in the natural area, they can take shorter trips to get all the types of protein they want. Whereas in the farmland sites, they're having to take very long trips to go get whatever resources they're trying to find. So the better proteins and better nectars. And so in doing so, they're working harder, which for our pollinators who are helping to feed us, it's not really what we want them to be doing. So forest and surrounding habitats, bee numbers and health are better near natural areas. And so we know this, the forest and surrounding wildlands benefit bees, but they can also benefit the farm. Decreased pollination, these are two studies for blueberries particularly. There's decreased pollen deficits closer to semi-natural areas. And so that's meaning that more of the berries get to full fruit versus some of their seeds only being partially pollinated. And so you get producible, sellable fruit. And then we know that farms adjacent to forests can have higher productivity. And so this is also not an isolated study or an isolated thing. My current boss, Dr. Claire Kremen, has found this within her research within strawberries and other farm types. But for blueberries, Kyle Bobby-Wash, I think this is published now, but I need to double check, have found that their farms that were near these natural areas have produced better. They've done better. And the farmers have made more money because of that. And so you know, we know that farms can do better when they're next to natural areas. And so in this way, the natural areas are both benefiting the bees and benefiting the farms. And, you know, like I was saying, it's not just blueberries. And so this is really the native bee benefits to farm. We're thinking about broadly, a lot of times honeybees are kind of the ones that are the main characters in the show, but this is why I give the example of blueberries, because they're not really the best here. Native bees are better at pollinating blueberries than honeybees are. There are more honeybees, so they get the job done, but they're just not great at it. And so we know that with wild bees or native bees, they're increasing production. This is within tomatoes. Tomatoes are another buzz pollinated crop. They can increase the fruit set. They can decrease pollen limitation, as I was saying with blueberries, but this is with apples. And then they are a safety net. And so they can work in conjunction with honeybees, filling in those pollination deficits and filling in as that pollination buffer, as I had sort of explained before, because there's so many species and they are able to accurately with their different levels of pollination and their different time periods and their different abilities, able to bring up our level of pollination across the landscape and not just within a singular plant. And so for summary of the blueberries, we know that native bees are important. We know that the type of the cultivar is critical. And then we know that natural lands or semi-natural lands benefit the bees and the farms. And so with this together, we can say that bees do better and farms do better. And so in this way, this is a little bit of an argument across these different studies to have a little bit more of a diversified landscape, something that is incorporating what we need from that working land. And so the farm is working, it's producing crops in a way that also benefits the native species that are there, that are then benefiting us. So it's sort of a circle. And so that's kind of to wrap up that like pseudo rant around diversified landscapes and pollination in blueberries. And so if you're wondering, what can I do to help bees and other pollinators? Planting more flowers is great. So flowers, herbs, shrubs, and trees. You can think about their shapes and the colors. So bees are attracted to different colors than maybe birds. Birds see red, bees don't see red. So having that dynamic is important, and things that produce pollen and nectar for the bees. Okay, and then the time of year when they bloom, because bees come out at different times of the year, making sure that you might, if you can, it's not always easy to cover the whole season if possible. So for the lower mainland, that is really, March to October. It is an extremely long season for the Northern Hemisphere. For Smithers, I feel like maybe a little bit closer to May to August would be just fine. I don't know when the snows go away for you, but when I was living in the mountains, the season was much, much shorter. And then you can think about what other bees or insects you're wanting to support. So if you're wanting to support butterflies, you could add their host plants or add the specific plants that your bee is attracted to. So like the snowberries for the snowberry bee. This is all based on what you can grow as well. Like that's totally new nuance to it, or an additional nuance. You can volunteer with efforts for helping wildlife. There's a ton of pollinator things popping up here and there within cities, and especially within cities, I think integrating more flowers, flower strips, flower shrubbing plants into our cities and towns is important. And then educating others about their importance. And so with that, I will open it up to questions.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Tyler.